Streamers and Punches music would go right here. Right. Yes. Hello and welcome to Streamers and Punches, the podcast from SoundNotionTV that looks at current events and new releases in the world of film music. My name is Bill Witham.
I'm Kevin Wilt.
And I'm Jeff Farawady.
On today's show, we look at creative writing process. What is it? What's yours? Well, we look at John Williams's. And we're going to talk about a couple other things, including a little new tech segment we've got where Mr. Jeff Farawady will take us through some steps that he feels are crucial to anyone out there that is interested in possibly building your own studio. What are some basic components you might need? And we're also going to look at Michael Giacchino's Super 8 score and talk about some of his points of inspiration for the movie as well as his score. Okay, well, let's just jump right in. Let's see. So there was recently an article. You guys, where was this? New York Times, right?
Yeah.
Okay. You did read it. I know you guys read it. Yeah, here we go. New York Times by James McKinley Jr. The title is John Williams Lets His Muses Carry Him Along. Again, like all of our articles, these will be posted on SoundNotion.tv/SAP. So if you want to read for yourself, you're more than welcome to go to our website and click on the link.
Yeah.
And let's basically sum up first, and then we can talk about what we thought of this. McKinley kind of just says, okay, for those of you who don't know who John Williams is, most Americans all know because they've heard film scores of his. And so he talks a little bit about what sort of his famous calling card scores of Jaws, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Harry Potter, Star Wars, Indiana Jones, Superman, E.T., so on and so forth. And then says that, every summer he likes to spend in Tanglewood. We actually mentioned the first part of this last week when we said that Williams was commissioning new statues. However, besides just the mention of the statues, he continues to speak with Mr. Williams about how he goes about writing the music, whether it's concert music or music for his film scores. Now, that's where it got interesting. What were some of the things that you guys thought stood out? And, for example, since it's all QA throughout the article, tell me what you thought was interesting, but tell me what the question was first, so the listener can hear what he was asked and then his response. Jeff, why don't you?
Sure. One of the questions that I absolutely loved was, do you ever get blocked? Because so many of us, when we're writing music in general, let alone film music, you face that, okay, what's next kind of thing. And it starts out with, I thought was almost kind of a cavalier answer. I know it's not, but it was sort of like, well, no, I never get blocked. And, oh, okay, well, tell me why. And John Williams, his response to, okay, what's next is to write something. He says, write something, write anything. It doesn't necessarily have to work, but at least you've got something down there. And then if you've got something down there and you know why it doesn't work, then you have the answer to making it work. So it was very interesting that the answer is not just to sit there with your hands in the air like, well, I guess I'm stumped. I'll go do something else. I'll come back. But no, write something. Put something down. I love that. The other question that stuck out to me was, what do you listen to for inspiration? And I thought it was particularly interesting that he says, I don't listen a lot. Either I'm going to go to the show and I'm going to listen to something that's better than what I write, which is very difficult for me to imagine sometimes with his level of skill. But he said that's not very helpful to go out there and sort of get demoralized. Or I'll listen to something that takes me away from the score that I'm working on. Totally takes me out of it. And then I'm not in the same genre. I'm not in the same mental thought. He says he can't even, have music on when he throws a dinner party because he'll be lost thinking of the music and getting carried away with all that. So he doesn't do a whole lot of listening. He says, when push comes to shove, Haydn or Mozart. So he's definitely into the classics, as if we didn't know that already.
Those are not composers that I was necessarily expecting from his answers. Because
I was kind of surprised by
his own music. It's not. That's not your first thought.
Those guys make me want to go to sleep. They don't they don't. I don't want to listen to them for entertainment or anything.
Yeah.
I mean,
I mean, I kind of see what he's saying. Not that I'm going to say, not that I can say, if I'm at a restaurant or at a party or something, and there's music in the background that I can only focus on the music, because even then my attention span's not very good. But just being a musician, the sound of music playing in the background tends to prioritize itself a little bit higher to my ear. So it's not that I can't focus enough to talk to someone. It is a little bit harder.
It is.
I kind of see where he's coming from.
I think it's interesting the not listening to anything, because it's I know we've had different experiences with that in the past. And Jeff, you'd mentioned before having I'm going to name drop here a bunch of different people that people may recognize and may want to look up or may not. But for example, you worked once with, I think, Augusta Reed Thomas, and
Right. Right.
I think, and sometimes she says to people, and I've heard this before from Claude Baker. This is a composer I've worked with. He's fantastic. And anyway, you need to go listen to more music. That's one of their comments. And I think sometimes that's right on the money when you're young. And so
Sure.
so it's kind of it can be a little bit of a mixed signal when Williams, who's I think approaching 80 now, right? He's 79, I think.
I think so. Yeah.
Right.
So to have him say, well, I don't really listen to anything, and I'm thinking, well, he's listened to a lot in his life, so he kind of knows. He knows he's got a good vocabulary and a good mental repertoire of what's out there, but also he's had such a long-standing opportunity of working with musicians and in a very quick turnaround. He writes something, and then the next month it's being rehearsed and performed and recorded.
Right.
So he can quickly say like what he likes and what he doesn't like. And
I wonder if it's kind of a conductor thing, because I've met more conductors than composers who say, "Oh, I don't really listen to much music," or when they do listen to music, it's not classical music. And one of the things he mentions, and this is certainly from his conductor perspective, is if I'm listening to a piece in the car or something, I'm not really enjoying it. I'm listening for intonation and precision and all the things that a conductor is going to listen for. And
Sure.
like I said, I've met lots
I
of
think that
conductors who
affects
say
all
similar.
a little bit.
Yeah.
I mean, there's times I've heard something, if it features brass instruments, I might think, well, the trumpet player was a little bit out of tune, but otherwise he's got a pretty good sound. There's a certain upbringing that gets switched on, and you can't help it. But sometimes I can shut that off, and I can enjoy it to some point. Yeah.
It's the curse of the classically trained musician. I think
You're
we
right.
all suffer from it a little bit. But I mean, I have trouble listening to the radio. I have trouble listening to a lot of music sometimes for those very reasons. You'll hear something, you want to go into analysis mode. It's what you're trained to do. And it's almost to the point where it's non-recreational. I mean, it really is. No, I'm working now.
Personally, I have trouble listening to classical music on the radio, but that's usually because classical music on the radio is awful.
Well, they have a very narrow field of repertoire. Almost.
I can only tune to that
hide it
station
again.
and hear harpsichord so many times.
Well, I mean, how many times do they play like Tartini trumpet sonatas or I don't know, harp concertos or tone poems?
Vivaldi wrote more than 400 violin concertos. Here's one of the ones that you don't know. Well, who cares?
Yeah,
or it's like some obscure composer you've never heard of who wrote in like 1690.
Here's a contemporary of Mozart that the rest of the world has forgotten about, but we're going to play.
Here's another whopper from Jonathan Smith.
Right. I found the question of the interview that I found probably most interesting was he's asked just straight out, can you tell us about your creative process? And it's not really surprising. I mean, he says, I write a little bit each day, and I write in the mornings, and it's kind of the first thing I do, which, for us as composers or any musician, every music teacher you've ever had tells you that. Do a little bit each day. Don't save all of it in the day before your lesson, which is, of course, what most of us do. And so, like I said, it wasn't surprising to hear that, but his justification for it, I thought, was rather interesting. And this is maybe, I don't know, maybe you can call it a little sentimental or a little meta or something like that. And he says, I have to write a certain amount of pages every morning before I can feel like the day has been served. And I thought this is an interesting perspective, because it's kind of like, if I'm going to call myself a composer, that means every day that I have has to belong to creating music. You know, if I want to go to the movies or go play a round of golf or something like that, you know, that's I have to do the work first before I'm allowed to take any other part of the day to do that.
Yeah.
I just wanted to name some other activities that sounded really white. Like before I go play polo.
Yeah. Exactly.
You know, I want to.
Before I go to the yacht.
I want to write down some notes. I remember
before I go
when we
commission
had,
a statue. Yeah.
I remember we had at grad school we had Carol Huza come in, who's certainly in the same, I'd say in the same age bracket as Williams, and he said he writes about 11 measures a day, fully orchestrated, and all my teachers were like, "Wow, that's amazing," and I just didn't really process the word or the number 11 as anything fantastic, but to be fully orchestrated, that must mean
that can be quite a bit depending on
well.
how
Yeah,
Right.
that means you're done with those 11, on to the next 11, and that's. I thought it was such an unusual number, though, to be like, you know, it's like a ready-made answer. How much do you write? I write 11 measures a day. It sounded very funny, but
well, I mean, for someone like Carl Huza, who's obviously done, you know, master classes and stuff before, I'm sure it's not the first time he's gotten the question.
Yeah, sure, right.
Sure.
With, you know, and it's easy to say, oh yeah, I need to write a little bit each day before I go do anything else. And it's easy to say, yes, that's a good habit to get into. You know, my experience has been that that's a really hard habit to get into. I mean, he even says, I was lucky. I got into that habit really young. But, you know, for most people, whether it's practicing or writing or whatever, that's a tricky routine to get into. And especially, you know, once you reach the end of a project, then it's like, oh man, now I can catch my breath and take a couple days off. And he even says, you know, when I'm not working on a film, I still need to devote myself to some musical project. I still have to be doing something. I can't just not do it.
What struck me was how much of John Williams' music do we never hear? I mean, as prolific as this guy is, if he really is sitting down and writing all this music every day, and when he gets stuck, he just writes and writes and writes until he gets past it. You know, how much of this music ends up on the draft room floor, you know, that we never hear?
I think that's probably going to be the case with any composers. And I think with most people, you don't want to hear that. I mean,
well, right.
I think back at some of the Beethoven sketchbooks. You look back at some of the Beethoven sketchbooks, you look at early Beethoven drafts of masterpieces, and the early stages are really, really terrible. Like, how did that turn into this great masterpiece? I don't want to see that stuff.
Well, and for me, it's
interesting how the
interesting.
sausage is made. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, it's interesting because, you know, he doesn't use the digital technology, and so for me, I'm such a proponent of that. If I don't like something, it's gone. It's toast. It's replaced. It's, you know, cut and paste, or it's gone. You know, so it's interesting. He writes everything out, and there probably is this collection of music sitting there on the floor. You never know. So that was interesting.
I think his is probably a more standard way of working, where, you know, he's got his couple hours each morning where he works, and you know, Stravinsky was kind of the same way. Stravinsky basically kept banker's hours where he would, you know, work from 8 to 5, and then that was it for the day. You know, other composers certainly work different ways. Bill, I know you're kind of a night owl kind of guy, and when you get on a big project, you essentially become nocturnal.
Yeah, pretty much.
You know, everyone.
So that it figures into that.
You forget what
you know, it's interesting too, because he kind of makes it like there's a, you know, to play devil's advocate a little bit, he kind of makes it look like he's got a filter, as though he's filtering out ideas if they're not good. But there's been several scores of his in the last 10 years. You know, he's not been working that much. That there's been some repetitive moments, from whether it be one of the newest Star Wars movies, or Catch Me If You Can, or even a couple years earlier, where Amistad had a theme in it that was almost just sort of dug back out and used again for Revenge of the Sith, and so sometimes I wonder if he sort of.
So are you saying, Bill, that because he writes every day, he's not allowed to have a bad score?
I'm saying that it you know, because he has to write so much, he's probably much less filtering of ideas in a way. I wonder, because
I mean, I think you certainly see that with a lot of concert composers who have, you know, kind of a big schedule of commissions, that they get to a point where, not that this is a problem I've had anytime recently.
I think Tan Dun had to do that.
Yeah, where
Things
projects are just kind
got
of rolling up so fast that you
Right.
just
yeah.
it and I think you see it a lot with types of composers who have so many commissions that eventually there's an expectation to what their pieces are going to sound like, maybe to a fault, where it's
Right, and maybe they're not allowed to bring in surprises or
exactly, and part of that, and I think something that they've talked about on an episode of SoundNotion, although this was a while back, they talked about some of the new Jennifer Higdon pieces. I think she's certainly one of them. She's had a really big couple of years. I am certain that she has quite a steady stream of commissions, and when you get to be that busy, yeah, maybe you don't have a whole lot of time for pushing out in new directions. That you don't have a whole lot of time to maybe filter out old things that you just have to keep going. Yeah.
And we often overlook how many similarities there are between the very first Star Wars score and the very first Superman score. Although I love both and I consider them different,
Sure.
there's a gob of similarities between the two. But anyway, okay. Well, I think that kind of exhausts that topic for now. Again, if you got some ideas or you heard something that you disagree with, or I wanted to add something, check us out, email us, let us know. Let's see, what we got to do next. Jeff, you going to take us through some tech stuff?
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm
Okay.
very excited about this this tech segment that we're going to be doing here. And to start us off, I kind of want to go into.
Well, tell us
Usually
why
no-
we're doing it.
Well, yeah. Well, the tech segment's designed to be something that can give people at home, whether they're listening or watching us, a frame of reference, so that when we're having these conversations about film music and we're bringing in the technology, perhaps the technology is causing some technique, as we talked about a couple episodes ago. I kind of feel like some of our listenership or viewership maybe doesn't have what they need to fully understand what we're talking about. So this is designed to give them sort of the basics, sort of put them in the seat of what if I was writing this music with digital technology, how would I do it? And that'll help them to understand Brian Tyler and other composers that we talk about that are really heavy into that. So going right into it, I thought we'd start with the 5 things most composers have in their digital studios. And there's not enough time, certainly, to go into all 5 right now. So for this week, I'm going to focus on the first thing that you're going to have in that studio, which is going to be the computer. I know it sounds kind of obvious, but the computer certainly is the center plexus for any digital music studio. It's where the software is installed. It also has the CPU power and the RAM to drive these large orchestral mock-ups that we keep talking about on the show. There's 2 configurations that are pretty common with the computers in most music studios. The first configuration is having one massively powerful computer, like a Mac Pro or a custom-built PC, that is your sort of center workstation. It has enough juice in it to drive your entire studio. The second configuration is also very common. It's having a series of less powerful computers, but they're all kind of rigged together like a local area network. They're all physically plugged into one another, so you can share the power that each computer has and use that to, again, make these large orchestral mock-ups. The sequencer is on there, and that's the software you use to compose, and also the notation software is on there too, so you can print out these high-quality scores and take it to the recording session. It's also where your music is stored, because everything is digital, and the digital information is on these hard drives that are built into the computer. So it's very, very important, probably the most important part of your workstation. Interestingly enough, no, not the most important part of your sound. And that's something that I can talk about in future episodes. And next time, I'm going to talk about the audio interface and what the audio interface brings to your studio and how it affects the overall sonic result. So
Okay.
That's the tech segment.
Okay, well, let's say I was in the market and I was a young up and coming composer.
Sure.
What should I just?
That means you
talking
don't have
about
any money, right?
computers. What's that?
That means you don't have any money, right?
Yeah.
You're
Yeah,
very
I don't.
poor.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
That means you have to buy a PC.
Yes,
Let's
exactly.
say I don't have any money. What do I go buy for just my computer?
Well, that's an excellent question. And I would direct people, especially if we're on a tight budget, to websites like Micro Center. Micro Center it's a great place. There's other stores like it where they sell the individual components. Because if you go out and to Best Buy and you buy a PC, that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, it's all done out of the box. but you're not getting quite as much CPU processing power for your buck. Whereas with a screwdriver, literally, and a couple of, screws, you can build your own computer. There's a lot of literature on the internet you can Google as well. And you'd be surprised at how much processing power you can get for such a little amount of money. I would say...
and as daunting as that sounds, it's actually, I've done it a couple of times before. It's really not super tricky.
It's
when you're looking for a computer to do, to write music and create demos and mock-ups and things like that. I would say that the things that you would look for is these sample libraries that you're going to use take a lot of hard drive space, so you need hard drive space, and they take a lot of RAM to actually operate, because
correct,
whatever you're going to use has to all be loaded up at once. So, those would be the couple of things that I would look for.
At least a quad-core processor, and I would say if you're going to be doing anything with large orchestras or even a medium-sized orchestra, probably at least 8 gigabytes of RAM to start. On my system, I've got 24 gigs of RAM, and I really wish I had more. Just to put that in perspective, yeah.
Well,
I also have a
I was just gonna say, this is for any listeners interested, because a lot of times when I work with students as well, just talking about music technology, a lot of times people want to know, well, what should I go buy? So if you got any more questions about this, email us, and just we should have an Ask Jeff segment, where maybe we take emails from previous episodes and then talk about them on the show and answer them live. That'd be one way to handle it. But if you got any questions, write to us. Yeah, definitely, and we'll respond to it. Yeah.
Yep. And like I said, tune in next time, because we are going to talk about the audio interface, and that's a pretty major component as well. So
cool. Thanks, Jim. All right.
Yeah.
Kevin.
So for our main segment of our show today, we're going to be taking a look specifically at the score to Super 8, written by Michael Giacchino. He's had a particularly... what was that, Bill?
When did it come out?
What was that? Maybe towards the beginning of summer. So maybe
it was May something, I think. Yeah.
May something.
So you're just full of great questions today, Bill.
I'm trying. I'm trying to be devil's advocate questioner.
Right. Giacchino has had quite a few films come out this summer. It seems like he's busy just about every summer. He's got usually juggling at least one TV show, plus doing a handful of films each year. We got Super 8 that he did early on in the summer, Monte Carlo, which I've basically heard described as a Sex and the City movie for tweens, and so I don't really care to talk about that very much.
Oh wow!
And then of course Cars 2, which is
the sequel that no one wanted.
Pixar movie, and he's certainly done a handful of Pixar movies. But we wanted to take a look at the score to Super 8, and really the avenue that we wanted to look at it was from comparing it with some older scores. Now, Super 8 was a film. Steven Spielberg was the executive producer. It was directed by J.J. Abrams, and this was. And I've heard J.J. Abrams describe it this way. He said that they basically wanted to make a 1980s Amblin film, in the style of E.T. or The Goonies or Stand By Me, or a lot of those types of films where you have an ensemble cast of kids getting into some sort of trouble. So from the film perspective, that was very much the goal of the film. So we figured, well, if that's where the film's coming from, why not take a look at the scores to some of those older movies, Steven Spielberg movies from the late 70s, early 80s, and kind of compare the music to what Michael Giacchino did here. The first thing I want to take a look at, I think the main films we're going to be talking about are E.T. from, was it 1982, and 82. Close Encounters of the Third Kind from 1979.
1979, yeah.
The first thing I wanted to take a look at is comparing sort of the main theme from Super 8 and from E.T. They're actually, on most levels, they're not terribly similar, but knowing that, with the nature of this project, Giacchino was probably going back looking at old Williams scores from E.T. and Close Encounters and things like that. I noticed some rhythmic similarities, and so I figured this would probably be a good place to start. This gives us a chance to hear kind of the main tune from Super 8. Now again, in terms of
That's
in
just our
terms
producer
of
screwing around with us.
in terms of energy and
Such a
mood
jokester.
and vibe and things like that, and even especially harmonically, that's quite a bit different from the main flying theme that's often referred to as from ET. But the thing that I noticed that I thought was interesting is rhythmically they have very much the same kind of profile, which at its most basic level they have 2 or 3 notes with a long duration, then a group of very fast notes, and then another 2 or 3 notes of long duration again, which we heard several times over just in that last clip. Now let's listen to that main flying theme from ET, where we hear again the mood is different, but that rhythmic profile is still very much present.
Yeah, I mean the presentation is so different with those
Right.
that it's easily disguisable, but when you whittle it down to what is, what's his sort of his rhythmic underpinning for that, his, like you said, the rhythmic profile.
Right.
That's that's kind of interesting too.
And,
One,
thinking, knowing how I think as a composer, and knowing that all the people involved with the making of Super 8 had to be going back to look at these old Spielberg films. It seems that
well, we see
not
the
just
similarities in the
coincidental.
look, so
Yeah.
we figured that there's got to have been some kind of conversation. Although, as a disclaimer, we weren't there in the
Right.
spotting session, and we weren't there in the meeting room, so we
Correct,
can't
right.
say that. Yeah,
Like
we
I said,
can't
it was
say
my,
that-
my composer sense was tingling, and I was like,
exactly. Yeah,
I don't know.
and that's why we
Yeah.
kind of thought, I don't know so much about 1941 or Heartbeeps or Dracula. Of those are scores by Williams, but other things from the late 70s or early 80s
I can tell you that
probably were visited and
Yeah.
and maybe
Sure.
paid some attention to.
Right.
So that's
Now-
why we
now
kind of zeroed on the two that we did.
I should say it could, a lot of times when we go back to our If You Like This segment or something, we talk about how, yada yada, this person stole from this and blah 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 blah. When we first came up with this idea of let's look at Super 8 and let's look at the score in context with these scores from the early 80s, it seemed like a really logical thing to do. In actually doing it, I feel anyway, it ended up being a more difficult thing to do. I mean, listening to the score of Super 8, there are you get the same sense as from E.T. or Close Encounters or some of these other movies of the period, but actually going through it and trying to find specific examples was much harder than I thought. And I think that's to the credit of Giacchino.
In some spots, I agree with that. In other spots, I think it's not so much. I mean, I thought that I thought I would find several examples from Close Encounters that would feel like not that they were ripped, but that they're so kindred that it's very obvious. And as I was listening to
I
Super
thought
8,
there were going to be more obvious ones, and I think the ones that we found, again, I think we ended up finding ones that were more general in nature and not quite so obvious first time through.
Well, when I went back and I listened to Super 8 and noticed that there's some nice textural stuff. And then I thought, well, I don't hear anything really overt that I recall from Close Encounters. But then I went back and I was a good little boy and I listened to Close Encounters, which I really should have done first. And then I found what was more like the jackpot. I want to look at the Aftermath class is a cue from Super 8 that kind of illustrates some of this. I want to listen to some of that now. Yeah, see, even in that example, it doesn't have much of, well, you could argue it does have melodic material, but it's notable, I think, for the use of register and the sort of the texture you get from those extreme register uses, and also the instruments that play them. So one thing that Giacchino's doing in that excerpt is he's got strings way high up, and then he's got later, once they just sort of hang there, which is like a 101 in how do you create suspense in any kind of drama or sci-fi or action movies. You have strings hang really high and don't do anything, just sit there. And once he's established that, then he brings in something low, and usually it's kind of snarling or a menacing kind of quality, which can be any combination of bass clarinet and low strings or low brass, or just one
Yeah,
or
it just
all
has
of
to
those.
be something in the bad guy octave, right?
Exactly. Now he even kind of brings in a little melodic material down there because, as we were describing, one of the differences we noticed in the Williams and the in Giacchino's approach is that Williams has a really vast vocabulary, as well as Goldsmith is another one who's good at this too. And these guys can just write and incorporate all sorts of different styles. I've not heard yet enough evidence that Michael Giacchino's got this sort of deep, like the basketball team that after the first five are out on the bench, are the next five that solid? Is the team deep? Can they go all
Yeah,
day? I don't hear
his
that in
bench
his
maybe
sound.
isn't super strong.
I don't hear it. Yeah, that's right. I don't think he's got Super 8 on his bench.
I
Sorry,
think
bad
I think his
knowledge.
score to The Incredibles, that was the most out there kind of different thing. It's like, wow, that's
Hmm.
something different from what he normally does, and that really has kind of its own character to
I
it.
mean, I
Yeah,
thought it was cool, but I knew
yeah,
that John Barry was the one originally asked to write that
sure.
score. So then when I found out he was brought in, and then I heard the end result just sounded like John Barry's James Bond music. But a lot of people I know remember that score. So
Mhm.
he achieved what
It
a lot of people
was
don't.
very
Um,
successful for him. Yeah.
but I think he's on the stride with Pixar. I think
Yeah,
his
that was his
approach,
first
and
Pixar film, right? I
yeah,
think it was.
yeah, the short he did with the storks was really, I don't remember it, but I remember it being really appropriate and really charming for the short that it did. And then Up was about as memorable. Um, Up to me beat out Ratatouille as being memorable and having like it just really well scored. But Ratatouille's well scored, but
It's well scored, but I mean, especially you look at the first 20 minutes of Up, and that's
it's almost all
that's
music, right?
music that's really really effective, and
Right.
Yeah,
it's
it's
done really really
one of the
well. And of course,
cinema's
everyone cries when
biggest
they watch it.
gut punches to the stomach is
Oh
what
yeah,
that is.
yeah.
Um,
I
but now
think
I want to look at, just to keep on the thread of the use of register. Let's listen to some of the stuff from Close Encounters. This will be, I believe, Roy's first encounter, followed by a little excerpt from Encounter at Crescendo Summit. You're going to hear some of the same. It's sort of a kindred spirit in the use of register and the use of orchestration a little bit, and just sort of the extremes, very highs and very lows, and it's almost all sound, like sound effects use, so it achieves a kind of a tone. So let's check those out. We can just do those back to back. All I heard was distortion where I was, but Dave clearly has that turned up to 11. So there we go.
it's the best way to
All
play
right.
it.
Yeah. Now there's countless more examples. Some that I didn't have a chance to prepare would include some of the use that later in the score, as the military come into the town in Super 8, Giacchino works on a combination of horns, and it's a very rhythmic series of ideas. And it's kind of like, not only is that instrument, but it's that instrument doing particular rhythms that kind of drives that section of the film. And that is also very kind of kindred spirit to when the military are kind of staking out around the mountain in Close Encounters, and you get kind of a very similar tone. And also the use of snare drum is fairly obligatory in most films when the military is concerned. So again, more examples there. You can investigate
Yep.
more on your own by purchasing or just seeing the movie. But
Sure.
there were some other things, Kevin, right?
It seemed. I mean, of all the things that seemed to be, and borrowed is probably not the right word. I guess maybe inspired is better.
Mhm.
I think just the general orchestration, the overall sound of the score is maybe closer to those older scores than any individual elements. Like I said, you listen to the score of Super 8 and it sounds, the whole thing together sounds like it could be some sort of early 80s score. But again, trying to find a small detail is maybe not as easy. So some of the orchestration things that kind of stood out though.
Mm-hmm.
You were talking, Bill, about textures and mentioned bad guy music and things like that. One of the things that Giacchino does in Super 8 is does this sort of slow melodic writing in the strings, where the strings are spaced out over a very wide range. And it's something that happens in ET. But let's talk about that in a second. Let's hear Giacchino's version of it from Super 8. Yeah, we hear a very similar type of orchestration in a few of the cues in ET, where Williams has this huge several octave span.
Like the forest chase, right? Or
Yeah,
whatever the
exactly.
cue
It
is
happens in
called.
the beginning of the film. It happens a few moments in the end of the film. It's generally a slower melody and half notes and whole notes,
Mm-hmm.
things like that. A big
What's that sound
span of
like?
strings, and in Williams' case, he also puts an organ in there and sometimes woodwinds. Similar kind of thing. And in both examples, both Giacchino and Williams, maybe a little bit more with the Williams, part of the ominous qualities, they tend to wander around through some different keys as well. So let's take a look at the Williams example. This is from the beginning of E.T.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there you go. Now, for me, I think that the biggest standout thing when listening to Super 8 and thinking of these older scores has to do with a certain combination, a certain type of orchestration that even when I was in the theater watching Super 8 and not really paying attention to the score, some things jumped out at me and it seemed a little, again, maybe a little too deliberate or something like that. And that's something when, if you take a look at E.T., the entire film, kind of the middle big chunk of that film, E.T. is hidden away in Elliot's closet, and it's only the kids that know about him. And as E.T. and Elliot, as their friendship is growing, there's a lot of this. It's almost kind of this intimate chamber music kind of thing where you have, maybe some string chords, but a lot of solo harp writing, which is, really intricate solo harp writing is not something you hear a ton in film scores. It's usually more of a color, or you get a lot of glissandos, but not a whole lot of soloistic stuff. But that soloistic kind of thing does tend to show up a lot in the Super 8 score, and it shows up in the same way. It's kind of fulfilling the same job that it was doing in E.T. So let's listen to Giacchino. His harp writing, you're going to hear the main theme that we started with. Yeah, well, let's listen now to again a very similar thing in E.T. You'll hear, the harmony that Williams uses is a little bit more complex. There's a lot of seventh chords and ninth chords and things, and maybe that dates it a little bit. I don't know, but it's a very atmospheric, and anytime you use that solo harp, it tends to be a very atmospheric, Debussy impressionism kind of thing. So let's listen to Williams' use. So yeah, there you go. I mean, overall, what did you guys think of this particular score?
Well, Jeff, go ahead and jump in there.
Well, I don't want to be I don't want to be doom and gloom Jeff here, but I mean,
just say it.
There's this thing called development, okay? And this is what we're contrasting John Williams with Giacchino here, right? And it's supposed to be this nostalgic score, right, going back, and I understand it, and I do agree with both of you. I think I hear the orchestration similarities, and I think the examples that you used were fantastic to point out those similarities. But there are just some ridiculous differences. First of all, you have J.J. Abrams going, I'll tell you what, 25 seconds, yeah, 30-second cue. Okay, you go back to John Williams, you have these 3.5-minute cues, in order to develop the music, you have to have time to develop the music. Okay, and you have to have an attention span. And I think
to be fair, there are a couple of factors you have to look at. It's first of all, comparing anything to E.T. is maybe a little bit unfair because it's, my personal belief is I think it's probably the greatest, if not top 5 film scores of all time. But part of that is exactly why, from what you just said, Jeff, is that on that particular film, and that particular film by itself, Williams kind of had a lot of freedom with music, especially at the recording sessions. There are these stories of, timing's not working exactly right, and Spielberg saying, okay, let's take the film off the projector, just conduct it how you think it should feel musically, and we'll make the film fit. That never ever happens, and I'm sure Giacchino didn't get that luxury.
But that's why this is a fair comparison, because why didn't he get that luxury? This is what I'm saying.
No one does.
There's a responsibility.
That's like the one time that's ever happened.
Oh, come on. Now, there's a responsibility that directors have. They're not living up to their responsibility. They're not giving composers enough latitude. They don't understand what development is. They don't understand what the composer has to do and the journey they have to go on. And that's what's happening film after film. You're having this 30 seconds here, 20 seconds here, low percussion here, instead of a theme which goes through these myriad phases of development as the characters progress.
Wait, hang on just a second. No, we're good.
There have always been that's always been the case between producers and directors and composers. Right. It's very rarely do you get a director who is, really musically literate, where they can very successfully communicate musically with a composer. And composers are always having to fight that fight.
Mm-hmm.
I think.
But Jerry Goldsmith, John Williams, Bernard Herrmann. I'm listing off composers here. These are all composers that had a very successful time going through that process. And I think, look, I'm not pointing fingers. I'm just saying that overall, we're seeing a trend towards shorter, quicker, in-out scores. And when you have that trend, it's very difficult for a composer to develop and to do what they're supposed to do. And if we wonder why there's a decline in film music and as a whole, I think we can look at that as one of the major factors that people aren't.
I suppose, but at the same time, I don't know that you can say, oh, a composer should be able to score more of the movie than they currently can. I don't know if that's a solution.
Well, they should be able to score more than 30 seconds at a time, for heaven's sakes.
I think he had longer cues than just 30 seconds at a time. Certainly, you're right. Some of the tracks on the CD
he did not. He did, but I'm just comparing it to other scores where maybe you'll see one 30-second cue, there's multiple 42 seconds, 30 seconds, a minute and a half. A minute and a half and 2 are sort of the longer side. There's one where it's 3.5. One of my favorite cues was when he scored the put together film at the end, the hokey film at the end, which wasn't even the film.
Well, I think a lot of people might say that was probably the best part of the movie too. I mean, in fairness, when Williams is scoring E.T.,
right,
he has a much better film to score.
Well, there
than
you
Michael
go.
Giacchino does with Super 8.
I absolutely agree.
I think that was one of the biggest problems, was that the film itself was not as good as maybe we all thought it was going to be.
Yeah.
Sure.
And it had a big narrative unfocused throughout. Like, it didn't know if it was a family story or a story about an alien. And then at the very end, it just said, well, it's everything, and the alien gets to take off, and it's just like E.T. Except, no matter how much music Giacchino brought in at the end, it had no impact on me emotionally, because I was very aware. Like, this is the part right here where I would cry, or the audience would shed a tear for the emotional impact.
Something that you and I had talked about a while ago that I think we'll probably have to come back to on a later show is the recent Alan Silvestri score for Captain America, and why that score worked well. Was the music that much better? Well, maybe not. But the fact that you actually cared what happened to the characters by the time the movie was over made the music a lot more effective. In Super 8, I don't, a couple of the kids, okay, they're nice characters, and there's, the fat funny one and all that kind of stuff. But most of the characters, because it turns into like this alien monster movie, you kind of don't care what happens. And when you're not invested in it, the music can't sell you the film by itself.
Well, the worst part was that Abrams outlines how you make your audience care about your characters. He outlines it by having he has one of the kid characters say it to the other to explain it to him, like, "Oh, you dumb kid, you don't get it, so we're going to tell you." Which is really Abrams telling the audience, "You have to do it this way, audience, so you'll care about it, audience."
Right.
But then he doesn't do it by actually practicing what he's preaching.
Well, maybe he was
collapses.
trying to preach the same message, and the sentence where the kid says, "And then you throw in a big scary monster," was just cut from the film.
Oh, yeah, maybe, because that's kind of how the film came out. I mean, I kind of think Giacchino maybe didn't have the palette that John Williams had. Not that he could do as good a job.
Well, I mean,
to a way we're being critical of him, but he didn't have
something
as good a film.
Something else that we had kind of mentioned, but before we started today's show was, there are a lot of moments in Giacchino's score or in the Super 8 score where, in similar moments, Williams might have a network of, maybe one or two extra counter melodies kind of going on, where Giacchino instead might just have some long notes being sustained in low brass or in the strings or something like that. And you could say, well, yeah, maybe Giacchino's vocabulary is not as good as Williams. Well, that you can say that for just about anybody. But I wonder, maybe that's also a stylistic thing too, that having these sort of long, sustained, atmospheric, almost sound design kind of scores is kind of the thing right now.
Well,
but that's maybe a discussion for a later episode.
That definitely is a discussion for another show.
How do you think this score fits with? How would you compare this to some of Giacchino's other scores?
Not as good as his Pixar work.
That seems to be the case. And I mean,
Bill,
you're not the first
curiosity
person that I've heard that from. That
I mean, it's a curiosity or a novelty, because it's the one film, maybe similar to The Incredibles, where it's going for an older style, and it's fairly obvious throughout. Well, to us anyway, what that style is. Whereas it's John Barry in The Incredibles, but the audience can actually listen to that and enjoy it. And then in this, I don't know that any audience would go out and buy Super 8, but we would note that it's going for that late 70s John Williams Amblin sound. But I think it's a valiant attempt. It just doesn't really get under your skin. I mean, we should address that. Yeah, I mean, it scores the film. It serves the immediate need of what he's hired for. But when we talk about film music,
the primary purpose, right?
That's the first part. It has to do that, and that's why Goldsmith and sometimes James Horner and even sometimes Elfman. That's why those guys are at the top of their field, because they satisfy that. But then there's that something extra special that gets to the heart, and you like to listen to it outside of the film too. There's something wonderful about. There's a power to it, which I know that's our producer's favorite way to describe music.
We all know our primary responsibility.
It's a magical, mysterious thing, right?
But it needs to be something you can listen to outside of the film as well. I think that's what separates the really good film scores from the we got our job done film scores.
right.
You know?
Well, we're
Because
just
they're all
great.
going to get the job done. You know, but only some of them.
They get replaced if they don't get the job done.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Correct.
And sometimes they get the job done, but at the last minute they decide that the film, which sucks, needs a new replacement score that'll make the film better, and it's never the case. But they do it anyway.
And they call James Newton Howard.
Right.
Yeah, or they throw out something from a decent person and hire a hack
Right.
job. Pirates of the Caribbean.
Not that James Newton Howard's a hack job, but he's not.
I'm
Other
not talking
people
about
are, but
Pirates of the Caribbean.
I think, you know, Bill, you mentioned Pixar, and you're not the first person that I've heard this from. That you have Michael Giacchino Pixar, and then you have Michael Giacchino non-Pixar, and the non-Pixar Michael Giacchino is almost never as good as the Pixar Michael Giacchino.
I wonder if it's just some kind of pressure that he feels to produce for Abrams, and then he maybe feels a little more casual and like we're in good artistic collaborative company with Disney and Pixar because these guys are all badasses.
You wonder. I mean, let's be quite frank. You know, Pixar movies tend to always be really good. Even Cars 2 that he scored this summer is considered to be kind of the first Pixar flop. But even though it's not quite as explosively successful as other Pixar movies, it was still supposed to be really, really good. So maybe when he is given better material to score, he can provide a better score.
And when he's given more latitude and he's given more time to develop the thematic elements. And I think that you see that more in the animated movies for whatever reason you do. And I don't think it's a coincidence that you have better music.
Especially,
right?
You know, you look at some of those Pixar films, and WALL-E, of course, is the best example, although I don't remember if he scored.
Newman.
Yeah,
Thomas Newman.
It was Thomas Newman that scored WALL-E.
Yeah.
But the fact is that with some of those animated films, with WALL-E being at the top of the list, oftentimes they're very much treated like silent films where there is that room for music to kind of live a little bit more.
Yep.
Where the music isn't, you know, competing with all the sound effects from Super 8 or Star Trek or something like that.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Well, speaking of movies where the music is competing along with sound effects, Jeff, if you will.
I will. In this week's If You Like This segment, we're going to be taking a look at music from the film Aliens and music from the ballet Gayane. Now, Aliens, as you know, was a 1986 science fiction action film. It was directed by James Cameron and starred Sigourney Weaver. It was a sequel to the 1979 film Alien, and it's set 57 years after the first film, with Weaver's character Ellen Ripley returning to the planet where she first encountered the hostile alien life form. There's a lot of action in Aliens, but oft overlooked is the softer, more tragic scenes that the music then accompanies. In particular, scenes involving Ripley and the young girl who's caught in the fray, Newt. So James Horner was tasked with the near impossible job of composing about an hour's worth of music for the London Symphony Orchestra in less than 3 weeks. Some rumors claim it was even less than that. So merciless was Cameron, and so difficult the task, so the story goes, that Horner got a standing ovation from the London Symphony just for completing the score. They were so impressed he was able to get that all done. So is it any wonder that he felt compelled to borrow some music from the great Armenian giant Khachaturian? So let's start by listening to Horner's lyrical, tragic melody first heard in the main titles of Aliens. Well, if you like that, you're going to love the ballet Gayane. That sort of lyricism is heard throughout the ballet, and it's actually written by, as I said before, Khachaturian. Guyana is from the Armenian saint Guyana, and the ballet centers around the story of a young Armenian woman whose patriotic convictions conflict with her personal feelings on discovering her husband's treason. The first production was on 3 December 1942, and it was later revised. Interestingly enough, despite that tragic lyrical theme, you also have the saber dance in Guyana, which is one of the most commercially recognizable themes from the so-called classical music repertoire. So if you like James Horner's Aliens, you're going to love Guyana, and it's certainly something that took a little bit longer than 3 weeks to complete.
Well, yeah, we should probably mention that this is probably not the last time James Horner will appear in our. If you like this segment, he gives us plenty of material to work with.
We might just call it "You Don't Like James Horner Anymore, but You'll Like This" or something along those lines.
All right.
And we will not play the saber dance at all. You won't ever hear it on this show.
No. Yeah, not even hummed. Yeah. Okay, well, that's going to do it for this episode of Streamers and Punches. You can listen to us on SoundNotion.tv/SAP, where you can subscribe to our show, leave comments, and find links to the music that we spoke about. Don't forget, you can also find us on iTunes, where you can subscribe, and we're even available on YouTube. So please join us next time when we discuss a comparison of Goldsmith's Planet of the Apes and Doyle's Rise of the Planet of the Apes. I'm Jeff Arwady.
I'm Kevin Wilt.
And I'm Bill Witham.
Thanks for listening.